Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Committee of the Whole meeting for Monday, February the 3rd, a blustery evening. Thanks for those of you who are joining us either in chambers or online. My name is Councillor Chad Rintoul, and I'm chairing committee this evening. I'm joined by my colleagues, Councillor Richard Novak, Mayor McNeil Smith to my left, and to my right, Councillor Duck, Councillor Duncan, and Councillor Garnett. Online joining us this evening is Councillor Terry O'Keefe, as well as staff members from the town of Sydney and management in attendance. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. I'd like to call the meeting to order at this point and respectfully acknowledge that we are meeting this evening on the traditional territory of the Wasanich people. The agenda has been circulated in advance, and I'll look for an approval of the agenda. Mayor McNeil Smith.
Sorry, if we have the agenda on the floor, I'd like to move an amendment, please.
Very well. So I'll move you as the mover, and Councillor Duck second.
Sorry. The motion amendment is to reverse 6A, the draft financial plan, and 7A, the development application. Reverse those in order.
Very well. The seconder agrees. Any other changes to the agenda proposed? Seeing none, I'll call the motion as amended. All in favor? Thank you. Motion carries unanimous. So that sees us moving to public participation on this agenda. Committee of the Whole, a maximum of 20 minutes, 4 minutes per speaker is allotted for public participation. And those wishing to address the committee are asked to please identify themselves by name and their municipality of residence. Individuals may only speak or ask questions regarding an item on the agenda, and I will note that we'll have a dedicated public participation opportunity with respect to the development permit application that is on the agenda this evening. So the remaining item on this evening's agenda is the introduction of the financial plan, including the budget. That item is before committee this evening for information and introduction only. So committee will not be deliberating on the budget that's before us this evening. It's just a matter of introduction to that process and outlining the budget. So with that, I will pause and call a first time for public participation. Good evening. If I could just turn on your microphone and introduce yourself.
My name is Dennis.
Sorry, Dennis, just press that little button there and your microphone will be activated. Thank you.
That's better? Okay. My name is Dennis Iwaziak. I live at 10418 Eden Place. I just wanted to say tonight, with regard to staff bringing forward a budget item to widen the gravel shoulders on All Bay Road, I'm asking council to consider deferring this item to a future date, perhaps the 2026 budget deliberations. The resolution passed last October stated, and I quote, "If wider gravel shoulders are approved as part of 2025 budget deliberations, one side of this section of All Bay Road be marked no parking to accommodate pedestrian traffic," unquote. If the primary concern is for the safety of pedestrians and council is willing to designate pedestrians only on one side of All Bay, then there's no need to gravel the boulevards. It would be much safer and accommodating for pedestrians to walk on the existing boulevard as it is, rather than to walk on gravel, particularly for those pedestrians with mobility issues, of which there are many living along All Bay. Staff's resolution to gravel both sides of All Bay appears to be a hastily developed accommodation to provide safer parking for Philbrook's employees, rather than a response to the need for pedestrian safety. This resolution was made without any consultation with the most affected party, which happened to be the residents of All Bay. If one side of All Bay becomes no parking, has staff considered where Philbrook's employees are going to find additional parking? When asked by council if Resthaven might provide a better solution for employee parking, staff stated in their report that they had not reviewed this area of Resthaven to confirm if it could accommodate the volume of vehicles that currently park on All Bay Road. Also, when asked by council if parking along the south side of Harbour Road rather than the north side might provide additional employee parking, staff's response was that the hedge along Harbour Road would not allow for passengers to exit their vehicles. If staff had taken the time to observe how employees park on all bay boulevards and the beach access on Bowden, they would have seen that almost every vehicle is parked with the passenger side abutting a hedge or some type of fencing, not allowing for passenger egress. This is the very same excuse they made for not allowing parking on the north side of Harbor Road. There's been no indication from staff that there was any consideration given to the environmental impact spreading all this gravel will have on Roberts Bay. All the storm sewers along All Bay drain directly into Roberts Bay. Several of the manhole covers have warnings that they drain directly into a fish habitat. Are staff aware of that? Further, how can staff budget for the materials and labor required for this project when there has been no decision as to which side of All Bay will be pedestrians only? Has staff even drawn up a plan which would show how many vehicles could be accommodated depending on which side of the street is pedestrians only? Members of our residence committee have looked at this, and the answer is 10 to 20 parking spaces, depending on whether it's the east or the west side of All Bay. 10 to 20 vehicles, somewhat fewer than are parking on All Bay now. Does parking for 10 or 20 cars or trucks really justify the cost of graveling both boulevards all the way along All Bay from Rest Haven to Jocelyn Place? I strongly recommend the council defer this item until such time as staff have completed a more thorough study of all the issues that will impact this resolution. Also, our residents along All Bay are looking forward to the Committee of the Whole meeting with council in March, where we can present more cost-efficient and practical alternatives to the rushed decision to simply spread gravel all over All Bay. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you. I'll look further for public participation. Call a second time. Thank you.
Randall Mang from 10436 All Bay Road. You would have all received letters from me in the past concerning the same matter, the parking on All Bay Road, and including letters that I wrote yesterday to Mayor, Council, and staff. I guess my fundamental question, frankly, seeing as how we're out here on a snowy evening, is this resolution still on the up for current 2025 budget consideration? Is that a question that I can ask of you directly now? Because if it has been deferred, then
You can pose questions. I'm happy to answer that, and then we'll ask you to proceed with your comments.
sure.
We are receiving the budget for the first time this evening. If you stay this evening, you will see it for the first time with us.
I see.
If you decline to stay, you can watch it back because it will be recorded and posted on the town's website tomorrow, or live stream this evening. And so some of my colleagues may have had a sneak peek and may see it on there. My expectation is, because it was a request and a motion coming from council to do so, that it will be in the budget and subject to budget deliberations.
I see.
I'll pause there and see if my colleagues or administration have any comment. Mayor McNeil-Smith.
Thank you, Chair. If I might turn to staff with regards to the process on Monday, March the 3rd.
Sure. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Chair. So essentially, staff would recommend to council and have recommended to council through the budget process that's just beginning tonight to keep that project in the budget. If council passes the budget with that allocation of funding for All Bay in there, then that doesn't necessarily mean that the project will continue. There will still be a committee of the whole on March the 3rd, where it will be discussed by council. At that point, council can look at multiple decisions that it has available to them, including carry on with the project as it is, walk away from the project entirely, consider alternatives or different approaches. Ultimately, there'll be multiple options for council to consider at that point in time. And that will be a committee of the whole meeting. Ideally, the committee then makes a recommendation back to themselves at a regular council meeting at a future date. Perhaps it would come back at the end of March for a final decision, or it could perhaps early April. So.
Thank you. Any further comments with respect to the question, Mayor McNeil-Smith?
Thank you. So As per council resolution last fall, when several residents of Albay came forward, council passed a resolution to have the committee of the whole meeting. That meeting is being held on March the 3rd. Notices are being sent out in the very near future to all Albay residents, informing of that meeting on March the 3rd. Staff will be making a presentation, and of course we welcome input from the residents at that time. Our final budget deliberations will be is at a special council meeting on Tuesday, March the 4th. As Mr. Edwards, our CEO, has indicated, we may choose to leave it in the budget, but subject to the process that unfolds after the committee of the whole meeting, the project may or may not go forward.
Great. I really appreciate the education. I'm very familiar with governance in community groups and charities, but not in municipal governance. So I do appreciate it. With that in mind, it does seem to me to beg a question as to why an item that hasn't just been met with, some protest, but in fact, I am very well aware that there have been dozens of letters written to council on this matter, as well as conversations from members of our community with staff, and they've been collegial conversations, and further exploration on the part of the neighbors who are deeply concerned about this for a multitude of reasons, including its evident misalignment with the OCP, with the concerns around environmental sensitivity in an environmentally sensitive and recognized area, with Albay's distinction among one of 4 distinct areas of Sydney, and including a bylaw that is in place that calls for a maximum 1 meter gravel on either side of Albay. I think that's bylaw 1390, if I'm not mistaken. So I know one of our neighbors, lawyer Paul McLaughlin, wrote a letter point for point, stating out all of the reasons why it seemed to be in conflict with the OCP. So I'm not here to sort of splay this all out. We can do that in a proper presentation. We look forward to the meeting of the Committee of the Whole. But I will just add that Albay residents do not have a parking problem. This is self-evident on any weekend or holiday. You look down our street and there is no parking issue among the residents. We are virtually, there's clearly a deference to Philbrooks, which is so emboldened by the lack of enforcement of an existing bylaw that says you can't park on a boulevard, that Philbrooks employees put a little laminated card in their window saying, we can park here. And despite them doing so, creating willful damage to public property, which is evident on our street and in lawns and front yards that have been lovingly cared for by residents, for decades. So it's an issue that the residents are very passionate about. We don't want to see the loss of our boulevard, and we're looking for more constructive solutions. People are working hard to try to bring forward constructive ideas, and we hope that council will hear us when the time comes. But for now, thank you for listening, and we look forward to a fulsome and due consultation and real analysis of options and what can be done. Because as we all know, we love this town, and if you change things materially, they will not come back. And that's the way it is. That's why we moved here from the Lower Mainland, where we saw our beautiful community that we'd been in for 20 years fall victim to what we would describe as sometimes hasty decisions that had irreparable negative impacts. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. I'll call a second time. Any further participants for public participation? I'll call a third and final time. Any further participants, public participation? Seeing none, thank you very much. If I could ask Mr. Edwards, if you don't mind just turning off that mic at the podium. Oh, thank you, Randall. Thank you very much. We are moving now to the development application that's before us, following the approval of the minutes, of course. Thank you for the reminder on either side of me. So I'm looking at the regular committee of the whole meeting from January the 20th, and I'll look for a mover to approve. Councillor Duck, seconded Councillor Novak. Any observations we want to address? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Thank you. Motion's carried unanimously. Next item is development application, and this is at 9895 and 9899 7th Street. We have a presentation representing the applicant this evening from Mr. Rob Pringle. Mr. Pringle, are you there online?
I am.
Hi, Mr. Pringle. Thank you for joining us. We're somewhat familiar with this project, having seen something come forward at this location previously. You have 10 minutes for your presentation, and then I'll turn to the public or members of Committee of the Whole in the event they have any questions for you.
Thank you very much, Chair. You guys can hear me okay?
Thank you, yes.
Excellent. And I do appreciate the addendum to the agenda and moving us ahead of the budget. Appreciate that. Can you see the screen?
I can, thank you.
Thank you. So as you mentioned, we are here to talk about 9895 and 9899 7th Street. Yes, this application was in front of you just a few months ago, and this is now the revised version of that. Just a reminder of an overview of where the site is located along 7th, across the street from Sydney Elementary, just down the street from 2319 Breath Hour, and next to the fairly new townhouse development at 9899 7th. This is the revised site plan. Previous, we were asking for a 1.5 meter variance to the front yard and a 0.5 meter variance to the rear yard. And this revised proposal, we have removed those requested variances. So we now meet the required setbacks on all four sides. And as such, we have an increased landscape area along the frontage, as well as the rear of the property as well. You'll note that it's fundamentally the same development. We've kept the same footprint, the same parking layout. As with the previous proposal, we do exceed the required parking amounts, and we do meet all of the EV parking requirements. You'll note the permeable paving surfaces outboard of the building footprint to increase the stormwater management. Here we have the revised landscape plan. Again, fundamentally the same proposal with landscape beds, some path work, sod lawn for the residents at the rear of the property, as well as a couple benches, seating area. We again have increased the planting beds along the frontage now that there's additional yard. And we've kept the entrance patio very much the same as well, with some seating area and some short-term bike storage. This is a typical floor plate. And again, we've taken a little bit of length out of the building, that 2 meters, just a little bit out of each unit, and been able to compact it ever so slightly while still maintaining a very usable and livable suite. The unit mix didn't change in this proposal. It still is 3 3-beds, 3 2-beds, and some 1-bed units, including all of the required adaptable suites by the town bylaw. One thing to note, I do apologize, I can't remember which councillor made the comment, but the north side of the building, Unit F, used to have the balcony facing the north onto the single-family home to that property. We've now relocated that balcony, and it now addresses the rear of the property onto the larger landscape area. So a little bit more privacy for that resident to the north side. Here we just got a couple renderings. So on the left, you will see the original proposal, and on the right, you'll see the revised proposal. Couple of things to note when we went through the APC process. It was noted by the APC that they wanted to warm and soften the park gate entrance by including wood screening over just the perforated metal gate. So you'll note on the new rendering, it does have that wood screening included as well. You'll also note that there is the increased landscape along that front yard. Here's another view of the front as well, same as before. Left rendering is the original application. The right rendering is the revised. Shows off that screening just a little bit more, and I think it does note that increased planting area along the front yard. Worth noting again that everything is fundamentally stayed the same. We are still asking for 3 variances for this development, one being the siding projection. As I've mentioned before, the eaves are an allowable projection into the front yard, but the vertical connection is not. So this variance request still remains for this proposal. This is the rear of the property, the northeast corner. I think this is going to be where you'll see most of the changes to this development. And again, by changing the 3-bed unit to take that length out of the building and adjusting it so that it faces the rear of the property, the longer setback, and away from that property in the north, gave us an opportunity to add some more visual interest to the north elevation by breaking up the siding and introducing a little bit more of the wood look siding, but still very much maintaining the original design intent of the development. And this is the southeast corner, and again, fundamentally the same. You'll note the permeable pavers, the landscaping, the building design is very much what it was originally, but again, changed to that 3-bed unit on the northeast corner. As I mentioned, we are still asking for 3 variances for the development. As I mentioned, the permitted cladding projection increased to 0.15, or from 0.15 to 0.3, I should say. Parking area percentage within the first story increased from 40% to 60%, which is actually less than the original development proposal. And then the location of the 3-bedroom units on the 3rd and 4th floor. So as again, those 3 units stack on that northeast corner. So yeah, we listened to the APC comments through that process. We listened to council and mayor during the last council meeting. Obviously, we were hearing that the project was very well received. It was a nice looking building, but the setback variances were the real sticking point. So we're hoping that in removing these setbacks variances, that it's much more palatable for council. And as included in the package, I did request that we bypass APC this time around, because I hope it shows that we did really listen to all of the comments that we received and made the development better. So I will end my presentation there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Pringle. I'm now going to turn to members of the public in the event there's anyone in chambers who have any questions regarding this project to the applicant or Mr. Pringle. I'll call a second time for public participation. Call a third. Just seeing none, I'll close public participation. Mr. Pringle, I'm now going to turn to committee to see if they have any questions of yourself on this prior to going to our staff report. And so I'll just turn to colleagues. Any questions for Mr. Pringle? Councillor Garnett.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Pringle, for your presentation. I appreciate having the comparison side by side of the original proposal to the updated one. It helps bring it into focus. And it's just a mild question, but it seems like a subtle change. I just want to make sure I'm seeing it right. Is that the glass on the balconies appears to be frosted in the updated, whereas originally it was just clear? Am I seeing that correctly?
That is a very good question. It was always intended to be frosted, so it might have been. It's most likely just the opacity of the export of the render, but it's always been intended to be a frosted glass rail.
Perfect. Thank you. And yeah, it was my observation about the balconies on Northeast, so I appreciate the fact that you've taken into consideration the neighbor at 9903. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Garrett. Looking at my colleagues one more time online, I see Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple questions.
Councillor
First
O'Keefe,
one
sorry,
is-
could you just speak up or a little closer to your mic? It is a little difficult, at least for me to hear you.
Okay, is that any better?
Not much. Pretend you're here and you're angry with me. Speak up.
Okay, Chad,
Yeah, thank you.
I'm just gonna see if I can, okay, put it up. How's that? Is that better?
No, but let's try it. Go ahead, and
Okay.
if we're struggling,
Okay.
we'll let you know.
Okay, sure. So first question is about pickup for garbage and recycling. So how is that set up? Will a truck come into the underground to be able to pick that up? Or is that something where they're gonna have to put bins out on the street?
So thank you to Mr. Pringle. You're muted. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, so I'm sorry. We do have a garbage room located here with some totes shown here, the green squares in the center of your screen there.
Yep.
I'm not entirely sure how the pickup will be taken care of, but we do have garbage room within the building on the ground floor.
Yeah, I did see that, but I guess my concern is, having a plan on how that's going to work. I guess I'm concerned about 8 or 9 bins going out on the street, which in the morning, which is a street used for a lot of kids and families going to and from Sydney School. So is that not something that you would kind of factor into the design?
It's my understanding with other similar developments to this that the garbage is actually picked up in the garbage room, and the people picking them up will go in, they have a key, they pull the bins out, so it won't be bins on the side of the road.
Okay, that's great. And then just another question, just in terms of accessibility for people with mobility issues, and I note that you've got the required number of adaptable units. I'm wondering, are the common areas also accessible for persons with disabilities who use mobility devices, like inside and out?
Yes, they are. Yeah. So the main lobby is going to be fully accessible, as well as the elevator will bring you up to all 3 of the residential floors. Once you're on those 3 floors, you'll have easy access through the hallway. Okay,
and I'm just looking, it looks like there's some outside areas as well. Is there, is it walking?
Yes, Yes, there's seating areas at both the front as well as the rear of the property, and then the pedestrian connection on the north side.
Okay, great, thank you. And just one last question in regards to heating and cooling. Any particular measures being taken to make it more livable in terms of excess heat buildup, especially in some of the higher floors?
That hasn't been discussed fully yet until we get into the detailed design, but typically we'll see some mini split units, so heating and air conditioning, as well as some maybe heat recovery ventilators or energy recovery ventilators in order to meet the step code.
Great, okay, good, that's all for me, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Keith. I'm turning again around the table. Seeing nothing from my colleagues, thank you very much, Mr. Pringle. You're welcome to stay on as we continue to address this item. At this point, I'll call on staff, Ms. Verhagen, appearing virtually with regard to the staff report. Ms. Verhagen.
Good evening, thank you. Yes, this development application has come before Committee of the Whole and Council previously. As was outlined by the architect, it is very similar to what was previously proposed, with the changes outlined again by the architect, the elimination of 2 of the previous variance requests. The rest of the changes are described in the staff report. And we do support moving this one forward to variance notification, since it has already gone to the Advisory Planning Commission, and they did respond to many of the comments that were raised at the APC. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hagan. I'll look to the council members, committee of the whole members, to see if there are any questions of staff. Councillor Duck,
I have no questions, but I'm prepared to move the recommendation.
let's just pause and just make one sure that online, Councillor Keith didn't have anything for staff. Seeing not, I don't see anything around. We'll proceed. Councillor Duck.
And I so move the recommendation that one, that owners and tenants in occupation of the property within 75 meters, 246 feet of 9895 and 9899 7th Street be notified regarding development variance permit application number DV 100368 to increase the distance exterior cladding is permitted to project from 0.15 meters to 0.30 meters, to increase the maximum percentage of a first story that a parking area is permitted to occupy from 40% to 61%, and to allow for less than 50% of the required 3-bedroom units on the first and second story, and that any written correspondence received be forwarded to council at the time of consideration of the approval of the variance. 2, that development permit application number DP 100848 to permit the form and character of a 4-story 21-unit multi-unit building for the property of 9895 and 9899 7th Avenue to be brought before council for consideration of approval if council authorizes the issuance of the development variance permit. 3, that as a condition of approval of the development permit application number DP 100848, the property owner shall, prior to the issuance of a building permit, plan to pay to the town a deposit in the amount of 115% of the estimated cost to complete the hard and soft landscaping for the development. And 4, that as a condition of approval of the development variance permit application number DV 100368, the property owner shall, prior to the issuance of a building permit, register a restrictive covenant on the title of the property, preventing the future strata council from passing any bylaws that may restrict occupancy of the building based on age.
Second.
Thank you. Motion is moved and seconded. I'll turn to the mover. Seconder. Seeing nothing there. Any other comments, discussion from committee? Councillor Duck.
I just want to commend the applicant from coming back after listening to both APC and council and making the adjustments. The building is a good-looking building. I think will be well received in Sydney. Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing nothing further, I'll call the question. All in favor? None opposed. Motion is carried unanimous. Thank you. Thank you very much to the applicants and presenters. You're welcome to depart unless you have a special interest in the budget presentation. At this point, we're moving on to the budget presentation. A reminder to committee members, this evening is an introduction to the process around the budget. So you'll get certainly a general overview of the budget and the steps that we will proceed through as a part of this process. So there will be an opportunity for committee to ask questions of financial staff with respect to the process, but this evening we are not getting into specific items that are being presented with an aim to look to make resolutions with respect to the content of the budget itself. So with that introduction, I will turn to Mr. Hissick for his presentation. It's just been suggested for the mayor that I reiterate to those of you from All Bay, in the event you wanted to trudge home in the snow now, that you're obviously welcome to stay and hear the presentation, but we won't be further addressing All Bay. I think that was made clear during the process, but just so that you're aware of that. Happy to have you join us. Mr. Hissick enjoys a crowd.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We'll just wait a few seconds for the...
Yep, thank you.
Welcome once again to our annual budget process. This is the first of a 3-part process tonight. For those of you who have been doing this for a while, you're used to all the legislation, used to the glossary of terms. But for those who might be watching either live tonight or later through the presentation that'll be posted on the website, if you'll please indulge me, I'm going to go through some of the background material one more time. So the legislative overview is that the community charter requires each local government to have a rolling 5-year plan that's adopted each year. So each year covers a 5-year period and provides authority to spend money and collect revenues to support operations. And until a new financial plan is adopted, the previous one is completely in effect. So right now we're operating under the 2024 through 2028 financial plan, and that gives us all the authority we need. The only thing we couldn't do ostensibly is any new projects that were not previously contemplated and included in the plan. So this financial plan establishes the basis upon which our property tax and utility rates are calculated. Next slide, please. Sorry, I'm just getting used to the idea of me not moving the slides forward myself, so I'm trying to catch up here. It's a work in progress. So the 3-stage process is tonight the budget gets introduced, and there always has to be a starting point, and that could be just me giving you a big binder like you have and no additional explanation and leaving you to your own devices. But I've always thought it was a much more effective way to provide the context at the same time that I give you the binder, so that as you go through it over the next couple of weeks prior to the next meeting, you have a little bit more information to go on. So tonight we'll clearly outline the starting point for our deliberations, and you've got the package in front of you, and it'll be made available to the public as of tomorrow morning. So it will be on our website, and each one of our budget meetings is recorded and also put on the website for those who may not be able to attend. On February 18th, which is 2 weeks and a day from now, we're going to undertake our initial deliberations. That'll be the first opportunity to discuss and clarify different aspects of the budget, an opportunity for in-depth discussion prior to final deliberations. And it'll be the first opportunity for public input, although we did have some tonight. As part of that next meeting, there will be a couple of fairly extensive staff reports that will accompany a second presentation, and those will serve to flesh out many of the new or more complicated aspects that are included in this budget. And then we'll reconvene on March 4th at a special council meeting for what we hope are final deliberations. At that time, council will have an updated presentation for the benefit of the council and the public, and the direction from the previous meeting will be incorporated. And the goal at that third meeting is for council to approve the financial plan. If by some chance additional meetings are required, those will be scheduled at that time. But in my 18 years here, we've only required one occasion where a second meeting was required, other than 2020 when we had to reconsider the budget following the pandemic. Next, please. Tonight's goal is to introduce the draft 25 to 29 financial plan to council and the public, to provide an overview of the major budgetary impacts, to outline the major capital projects and supplemental requests that are coming forward for approval, and to add context to the review of the budget documentation. Next. You anticipate my needs so well, Ms. Chen, thank you. So I've been using this slide for a few years now, and it still remains true. It's another unique budget year, as they all have been since 2020, since our world changed in a dramatic way. So in 2020, we had completed our budget process and then the pandemic hit and we had to reopen it again. We cut our revenues at that time. We rolled back the 2 some odd tax increase to 0, and we further reduced the tax increase, well, the base taxes to commercial properties by 10%. We made up for lost revenues by borrowing from a surplus, and we've added many services since 2020. But we knew at the time, and we know today, that we must eventually bring our tax revenues up to the level they need to be at now that our temporary funding has all been exhausted. In addition to that, we have to account for all the impacts that have happened over the last few years that have not been fully covered through taxation. So after the pandemic hit and we cut our taxes, we were fortunate to receive a substantial Canada BC Safe Restart grant that truly helped us in the transition. It helped us initially to replenish the surplus that we took to balance the 2020 budget, and it also made it easier for us to gradually accommodate the changes over the subsequent years and to slowly try and increase our taxes to the level it needed to be at. So the last small portion of Safe Restart funding was used in 2024, and we're fully on our own as of this year. So inflation is another factor that's really impacted our budgets over the last several years. The 2023 budget year saw an inflation rate of 6.96% from the previous calendar year, which was the highest I've ever worked with for a budget. It was lower for last year, but still fairly high at 3.71%. The rate for 2025 is beginning to stabilize, and it was at 2.5% for calendar 2024. And those are CPI rates, which, as we all know, are not the best measure of the town's costs. And really, it's the cumulative impact that's reducing our ability to keep tax increases to a minimum, not any individual year, but the cumulative. Everything costs more, and we're not immune to that reality. This is just a graphical representation of inflation over the last 10 years or so, going back to 2014. So that the trend rate of average CPI over that time span has been 2.5%. But that 2.5 includes the large increases that we saw between 2021 and 2024. If you take those out of the equation, a more accurate reflection of historical CPI is closer to 2%. And I hope we're getting back to that world soon, although recent events might bring that into question. In addition to the tax decreases we saw over the last few years, the inflation we've seen over the last few years, there has also been an expanding in the areas of responsibility for local government. We're under ongoing pressure to respond to services that previously were outside our mandate, things like affordable housing, homelessness, climate change, accessibility improvements, economic development to some degree, reconciliation, new services such as policing dispatch, emergency management, and medical first response. On their own, each of those is a challenge. Put all together, you can see why we're facing fairly significant impacts to our budgeting. If you look at all of those things, each and every one serves to take our focus on keeping taxes low and just bringing a little bit of lack of clarity to it. So you add an environmental lens, you add a climate lens, you add a social lens, you add an economic lens, you add a reconciliation lens, and it all becomes more complex and more costly. And all of that is while grappling with our traditional responsibilities like infrastructure replacement and expanding recreational opportunities. Now, I know you like to get this number up front, but I'm a little bit concerned that this year, revealing it now will kind of deflect your attention from the information I'm going to give you because it is such a large number for Sydney. Our draft financial plan starts out with a general tax increase of 12.85% for 2025. So that 12.85 includes several new budget items that have not yet been approved, and those are subject to council approval over the coming weeks. So I'm going to cover through the rest of the presentation what's included in the above figures, and we'll identify some areas to focus on and decisions to be made as we go through the process. So we begin our budget process at a staff level each and every year by taking a realistic look at the level of tax increases that we need to pay for everything that we want to do and everything we've been asked to do by council and the community in a larger context. So that doesn't mean we have to end up at the level we go in at, and there are several supplementals to consider that may not be approved, and there are some initiatives that might be deferred. However, there is very little latitude for more funding from surplus as we've managed to do over the last few years. Given the status of our accumulated surplus, we want to be careful about kicking this issue down the road, and council considered a detailed report on the status of surplus back in December, and some recommendations were made to keep using it for the next 2 years to some degree, but come forward with a plan to replenish after that. A quick overview of the major components of the budget, the glossary if you will. We have general water and sewer funds that are each funded independently. The general fund primarily through taxes, and the utility funds through water and sewer user fees and parcel taxes. Each one of those three funds has an operating and a capital component. Key features of all of these will be highlighted as we go. How's my pace?
Perfect.
So we'll talk about capital budgets, which are primarily for the renewal of existing infrastructure and other town assets, as well as new items or projects. We like to present these in terms of ongoing programs, new items, or items carried forward for completion. All funding sources for capital are identified in your materials, and the level of annual property tax funding from year to year is fairly consistent and not very high. Tax-funded items tend to receive the most attention, as those are the ones that have a tax impact. But as mentioned, our level of tax funding is not significant, and there's really not much benefit to, well, you can always cut a few things, but it won't have a major impact. Supplemental requests are in the operating budget, and those represent changes to existing service levels, new or additional items. They're often one-time studies or minor operating items that cannot be accommodated within the annual operating budget, but they can also be major ongoing items such as the firefighter hiring plan that we've seen over the last number of years. Sometimes supplementals are a result of external requests, like a community group wanting more funding, although there's none of that this year. We have seen that over the last few years. So the Shaw Center came forward late last year for a permanent ongoing increase, and that was approved at the time by council, and that is not flagged as a supplemental because it's been approved. There tend to be a certain level of supplemental items every year, but it does fluctuate in terms of magnitude. And the change in cost from the previous year is identified as a tax impact. Most of the significant items are backed up in more detail in your binder, as well as in the report that you'll see as part of the second meeting. We also talk frequently about service levels and what that really means. So the base budget that is developed by staff is put together to maintain existing levels of service to taxpayers. In other words, what does it cost to provide the services that have been previously approved by council through past budgets? Staff use our collective extensive experience along with the latest external information to determine the cost of delivering that council-approved mandate. We don't budget for worst case, only the most likely case based on our experience. And various departmental budgets are developed on that basis. We look at the bottom line for each function, not necessarily each line item that makes up that function. And individual line items are only a best guess as to the mix of labor, contract, and materials that are going to be required to get the job done for that year. So it's not always an increase. We look for efficiencies wherever possible, and only where those are not possible do we build them into the budget, either as part of the core or as flagged as supplemental items. We talk about reserves, which we're allowed to set aside through bylaw for very specific purposes. And then once those reserves are established, the funds within those reserves can only be used for their intended purpose. We have a number of reserves for asset replacement, whether that be infrastructure assets like roads, drainage, water, sewer, but also vehicle replacement, including fire vehicles, computer equipment, and the ferry terminal. We have a few less defined reserves, such as general capital, and a few others, such as land sale, amenities, and climate action, as well as Growing Communities Fund, which is made up of a large grant that the province provided 2 years ago. You might ask, what is the required balance that should be kept in each reserve? And the answer to that is, it depends on our plans and our funding strategies. Some reserves are easy to establish in terms of required balance, such as computers and in the past vehicles, although that's becoming more of a challenge these days as supply chain challenges are really impacting vehicle inflation. Other reserves require more investigation, such as the infrastructure reserves, and the asset management plan, which is in its final phases, is helping to address that. Reserve balances will be cyclical. Some years we put more money in than we use, and others we put money aside for a large project in a future year. We have very limited reserves for buildings and waterfront infrastructure. We do have the ferry reserve, but that's in the long term not enough to fully satisfy the capital requirements, and we're going to have to provide some of our own funding down the road. In the past, we have borrowed whenever we have to replace a large town building, like the community safety building, the parks building a number of years ago, and that has been part of our funding strategy, but that is always subject to review and change as we move forward. This is a snapshot of all of our statutory reserves, showing the beginning balance, the 2025 contributions, the budgeted 2025 use of the funds, and the projected ending balance. So you'll see that we'll be depleting our reserves to the tune of about $6.5 million if we spend everything that's in the budget. But we never do that. To some extent, we have ambitious plans in our capital program, and it's good to have the funds in place in case the stars align and everything goes well and we get all the work done. But it doesn't always happen that way. And as an example, this slide last year projected an ending balance of $7.2 million, and as you can see, we're at 13.5 to begin. So that's an indication of the fact that it's not as bad as it looks. And speaking of what is and is not in the budget, just because a capital project like Albay is in the budget, that isn't a guarantee that it'll proceed. For that specific project, council's already guaranteed that there'll be additional consultation. So having it within the budget just means that if all the details are worked out to everyone's satisfaction, it may proceed. By not including it in the budget, that means that absolutely cannot unless it's added subsequently. So there's no harm in including it just in case. It's not tax funded. It has no impact on the property tax increase for this year. A quick word on borrowing or debt. It's important to note that any debt held by the town is for the purpose of capital acquisition and construction and bears no relation to the type of debt that we associate with senior governments who tend to accumulate large deficits for paying operations from year to year. We're not allowed to do that. We can only borrow for capital projects. There's no new debt included in the 5-year financial plan. We have very strict rules around borrowing in terms of limit and process. The town has relatively low levels of debt and more can be incurred if required, but it's likely subject to public process. Our ability to borrow a cent free is getting more and more limited. Last time I made the calculation, we have access to about another $500,000 to $600,000 in debt servicing without public approval. But not to say that having that room will automatically use that process. We might choose to have a more onerous process around approval anyway. So there's no new debt proposed at this time, but I'm not necessarily discouraging it as a future funding source should the need arise. Quick word on short-term borrowing. We don't have very much of that, but we do have access to up to $600,000 a cent free for loans of up to 5 years. And that does not constitute part of our long-term debt limits. That's strictly separate. So in terms of what goes into building our budget, it's council requests that come in throughout the year. It's community requests, which often go through council as well. It's also the best judgment of trained, experienced staff to maintain what we have, to make purchases to reduce ongoing operating costs, or to add new features or amenities for the community. Our staff take their role very seriously and bring forward ambitious plans each year to address service expectations. We're going to move on to the water and sewer utilities, beginning with water. And for us, water includes the bulk water purchase from CRD, as well as the operation and maintenance of a distribution system. We have in that a water infrastructure renewal and capital projects as well. And the water fund, water utility, I should say, is funded with water parcel taxes and user fees. The infrastructure levy or parcel tax remains at $75 a year, but we are recommending a slight increase to the fixed charge to $24.50 per quarter. This would be the first increase to that fixed charge since the new rate structure was implemented in 2021. We're also passing on the increase in the bulk water rates from the CRD in the consumption charge, as we will every year under this new rate structure. And that is, I believe, 4.9%. So the reasons for the increase this year, primarily, well, the CRD bulk water rate is an automatic pretty much, and it's fairly modest. But the reason we're increasing our fixed fee is because, in line with one of the goals of our water rate review, we told you a number of years ago that we were looking to ultimately match our transfer to infrastructure reserve for asset renewal to the amount of the infrastructure levy parcel tax, and this is the year we're doing it. And that's simply because over the last few years, those fixed costs have moved up without any corresponding increase to the fixed charge. So that water rate structure that was implemented in 2021 is working incredibly well in terms of covering the actual cost of delivering the service and keeping up with the fluctuations in water use. Moving on to the sewer utility, it includes our share of operating the unified treatment plant, which again is a CRD service on behalf of the peninsula, and the operation and maintenance of the collection system, as well as infrastructure renewal and a few capital projects outside of that realm. Again, it's funded by parcel taxes and user fees. No change to the parcel tax, but there will be a fairly large increase to the user fees. You've heard over the last few years that the sewer utility is suffering a little bit and in need of a review of the rate structure, as we had in water a number of years ago. And we do intend to get to that review at the end of this year with a new structure in place for next year. We are proposing that the sewer user fee increase to $10.70 per 1,000 gallons of water consumption, and the impact of this to the average residential account will be $12 or less per quarter. The reasons for the increase are more cost increases for the joint treatment plant, which makes up about 60% of our operating budget for sewer. There's also higher costs related to our own system repairs and maintenance, and we've exhausted the sewer funds surplus, which we've been using to defray any increases. So we do plan to get to that rate review, and the time has truly come to right size our sewer rates the way we have with water. The general operating fund is made up of a number of program areas. Legislative and government, which includes administration, finance, computer services, driver services, and some overheads that aren't charged out. We have protective services, which includes police, fire, emergency programs, building inspections, and bylaw enforcement. Engineering and works includes all the stuff you would expect, as well as, in our context, docks and ports, which is not common to all local governments. We have waste and environmental services, municipal planning, parks, and what we call cultural, which includes library, the senior center, and 2 museums that we fund. And finally, fiscal services, which captures our reserve transfers, debt repayments, and community support payments. So significant items impacting our general operating budget include supplemental requests, of which there's a net increase of $544,000 over last year. And in addition to that, there's the full year impact of several items that were approved last year for a partial year. That adds a further $75,000. Next item is reserve contributions. We're adding $100,000 in the general fund, as well as an additional $107,000 in the water fund. The RCMP contract is once again a fairly substantial impact at close to $200,000. And RCMP dispatch, I'll cover that a little more detail in a few slides when we get to policing. In terms of personnel costs, bit of a perfect storm this year. Both of our union collective agreements expired at the end of 2024 and are due for renewal. So we've built in larger than usual increases for that, because we are seeing what's out there in the contract worlds and what others are settling for. There seems to be a bit of post-COVID inflation catch-up on a lot of collective agreements, and I don't think we're going to be much different. We also saw our first management salaries market review since 2007-2008, late last year. Another significant impact on the 2025 general operating fund was the reduction in offsetting revenues. So the growth in the tax base was low again for the second year in a row, although we are expecting a slight rebound over the next several years, because we have a number of large projects that were approved over the last year or so, but have not yet started rolling in terms of assessment growth. Not only the ones that are in progress now, but the ones that were recently approved and the ones that are coming forward soon for approval. I do anticipate we'll get back to the $200,000 plus year range as early as next year. So as mentioned, the Safe Restart grant is all used up as of last year. Surplus funding is below minimum policy levels. We're still using a fairly hefty chunk for this year and next, but our capacity to use even more is severely limited. So the core operating budget was once again built with no across-the-board inflationary increases. The departments only increased in areas where they absolutely had to maintain service levels, and anything beyond that has been flagged as a supplemental item. So where there were contractual obligations or unavoidable external utility costs, we built those into the base budget, but anything beyond that has been flagged. It's really the cumulative impacts of inflation that have required a larger than average catch-up increase to maintain service levels. So I just spoke about the additional revenue through growth in the tax base. We had a really good year in 2023 after the Amazon building was built, and that alone helped to defray the tax impact for that budget year. But the last two, we haven't had that luxury, so the tax impact has been a little larger. I will now take you through each of the operating departments with a couple of highlights as to what makes up the increase, or in one case, decrease for each. So general government, I mentioned what that encompasses earlier. There's a net increase of $382,000 over last year, which is a fairly hefty 15% on a total net budget of $2.84 million. Now, $120,000 of that is supplemental items, things like the civic sites ongoing investigation, the public survey that's about to come out, as well as a long pending records management project. So we expanded our human resources function a couple of years ago, and we moved part of the safety officer's cost from Public Works to that new function, which also contributes to the increase in this particular area. There is an offset elsewhere in the budget. So we have lost some one-time funding that was used last year and the year before to defray some of the one-time impacts, and there were some salary adjustments as mentioned earlier. Protective Services, starting with the RCMP, there's a net increase of $232,000 from last year. Nearly $200,000 of that is the RCMP contract, and those costs have been escalating over the last few years as collective agreements have been signed at the federal level for the RCMP. We do have a little bit of prior year savings again to partially offset that this year, but that's a one-time benefit. There is one supplemental increase for additional part-time auxiliary staffing. The net impact of that is just over $23,000 when you factor in the North Saanich share. So the cost of RCMP dispatch, policing dispatch, was downloaded to 10 South Island local governments beginning April 1 of this year. We do have a firm cost on that finally, and it's $331,000 for 9 months of this year. That is slated to go up to a full year cost of $460,000 next year. We're proposing funding the 2025 portion from surplus for a couple of reasons. One, we're already facing a significant tax increase, and two, there still remains a slight amount of uncertainty about whether these costs will in fact begin in April. The mayors of the 10 South Island communities, as well as staff, are meeting tomorrow morning with the minister to discuss this issue and lobby once again for some transitional funding for this, or perhaps a rollback of the download. We hope to have some resolution or some progress on that file before the end of our budget, but nothing is guaranteed. It might have to go through the province's own budget process. And for that reason, I think surplus funding, is appropriate in this instance. And if we end up getting lucky and not having to pay the full amount this year, or not at all, then that funding will remain in surplus for future years. Moving on to fire and emergency services, we're looking at a net increase of $425,000 over last year. A lot of that is due to supplementals. We are hiring a second deputy fire chief with an April 1 target hire date. We're also looking at the full year of several personnel-related supplementals approved last year. And again, the end of the initial contract with the firefighters union. We are projecting a fairly large increase, but the good news is that it's only 5 firefighters impacted. Building inspection and bylaw enforcement, it's a net increase from last year of just under $60,000, and largely it's due to a personnel cost reallocation from another function. So it's not a net increase per se organizationally, just between one function and another. So we've noticed that some of our staff are spending a fairly healthy amount of time administering the business license function, so we're allocating some staff costs to that function this year. We are expecting building permit revenues to bounce back a little bit, pursuant to the conversation we had earlier about the pending developments. Development services saw a net decrease from last year, largely due to that personnel cost reallocation I just mentioned, and also because of provincial grants for housing policy impacts that we're using to pay for a couple of our studies and bylaw updates this year. Engineering and works is a net increase of $134,000 on a net budget of over $2.5 million. And all of that is covered by supplemental requests for this year, the largest one being an increase to our storm drain repairs budget. Environmental services is a relatively modest increase of $20,000 as a provincial grant covers most of this function. Parks and cultural has a net increase of $287,000, on a net budget of 2.2 million. Just over half of that is made up of supplemental items that are up for consideration. So it's things like additional playground equipment, additional park space, more green spaces, as well as downtown landscaping. It's having a cumulative effect on the ability to absorb within existing budgets, and it's come to the stage where we have to ask for more parks funding to just keep up with all the things we've added in terms of park improvements over the year. Something as beautiful as the 4th and Beacon streetscape improvements by the coffee shop there. It's a beautiful area that's an external living room for the community, and it's a template for the rest of Beacon, but it does add cost to landscaping the downtown areas. As well as that, our events continue to grow, and the success of those events. We have a longer growing season and maintenance season the last couple of years due to weather. And as mentioned, there's a level of catch-up following years of overages through trying to absorb the new demands in existing budgets. The last component of general operating is fiscal services, and there's a net increase of about 188,000, which is made up of reserve transfers with some offset in other functions, as well as debt servicing, which is entirely related to the parkland debt we incurred last year. This is the first year we have to make our initial principal payment, and last year we only had one interest payment. This year we'll have two. Community support budget's going up by 34,000, almost entirely because of inflation. There's one very small supplemental item that we'll cover. So as mentioned, supplementals are one-time or ongoing additions to the existing level of service. And all of the following supplementals have been included in the draft budget. So approving one won't mean more of a tax impact. It's just not approving one will mean less. There are brief descriptions in the binder, and more will be provided for the next meeting. So the major supplemental items are in the fire department, the second deputy chief, which is 150,000. Engineering services, a number of new requests add up to 140,000. Parks and library, 146, and 120 in the admin function. A number of other small items add up to just under 40,000. The total 25 impact of these supplementals is 605, but when you deduct the net impact of one-time 2024 items, it totals 544,000. And I should point out that there was one mistake that was discovered very late in the process after the materials were put together. There's one $25,000 ongoing supplemental item for increased sidewalk maintenance that was actually approved last year and should not have been flagged as a supplemental this time around. Included in supplementals are several items that are not tax funded and therefore have no impact on the tax increase. And those are typically grant funded environmental and planning initiatives, as well as water and sewer utility projects, including the increase in transfer to the water infrastructure reserve that I mentioned earlier. And again, police dispatch is a supplemental item that's surplus funded for this year only, but you will see it in year 2 at 460,000, which is roughly a 3% impact. So there are several large items in years 2 to 3 of the supplemental requests plan. RCMP dispatch being the biggest one, but there's also a major crime unit item in 2027, which is pending, as well as various studies and updates over the next, over years 2 to 5. So all those future year supplementals will be revisited before they are confirmed, and next year's budget process will be one last chance to either change, reduce, or defer something that's currently in there to the extent that it's within our control. I'm not sure dispatch will be, but that remains to be seen. In terms of personnel impacts on the budget, I've mentioned these all before, but it's worth quickly covering again. The deputy fire chief is the only new full-time position we're adding, and there's additional auxiliary support for the RCMP, which equates to about half a position, which is about half funded by North Saanich, so about $23,000 impact. Total personnel I think these numbers need a slight update. I apologize. Last year's slide. I apologize, a remnant from last year's slide. The second and third bullet points were all from last year. But the next presentation will be obviously done by Mr. Edwards once I'm out the door. Try your best, but there's always a few things that escape. A quick graphical snapshot of our general operating revenues, showing that the general operating budget is about 2/3 funded from taxes. That's why budgetary impacts are difficult to absorb in any other manner. We do have fees and charges where applicable, but to a large extent, many of our services are not recoverable. Government transfers make up a small chunk. They're probably more significant on the capital side. And even on the operating side, that 8.8% is larger than it typically is because of a couple of fairly substantial new grants that we're using that the province allocated over the last few years. Reserves and surplus fund about 5% of our budget. Parcel taxes and payments in lieu of taxes are another tiny sliver. Investment revenues and other revenues are under 4%. So you see that any cost impact is almost certainly going to have a tax impact because it's such a large proportion of our operating funding. Moving on to tax-funded expenditures, you see that policing remains the biggest piece of the pie, followed by public works, followed by, for the first time, fire and emergency has overtaken general government, so that's the third largest, and recreation and culture makes up about 11%. 10% are for transfers to infrastructure reserves, 6.2 or over $1 million to community support. Now, an overview of the capital budget, which for 2025 is earmarked at $9.67 million, which includes $6.8 million in replacement plan projects, $5.1 million in infrastructure, and $1.7 million in other equipment and vehicle replacements. We have $307,000 in recurring programs that you see every year, and $2.6 million in one-time projects, which are largely related to the active transportation plan or park improvements. So this number does not include several projects that will be carried forward from last year at a later date. But because they're in progress and already approved, I didn't want to obfuscate the ones that are new or ongoing. And those, and also the amounts are not yet known, so those will be brought in at the bylaw stage. At the present time, it looks like roughly 18 to 20 additional projects. In terms of capital funding for that 9.67, 7.6 come from reserves, 1.3 comes from the Canada Community Building Fund or gas tax, about 300,000 from funds carried forward, only about 219 from taxes and user fees, 67,000 from North Saanach's share of RCMP costs, with other minor funding sources representing 179,000. In terms of property tax funding for this year's capital program, we're looking at 155,680, which is about 29,000 more than last year. It's still incredibly modest compared to where we used to be back around 12, 15 years ago, where we were typically using about $500,000 to fund current capital. But $200,000 is our new norm, and we've managed to get under that the last few years. In terms of significant projects in the plan, we've got $18 million over the next 5 years for infrastructure replacement, $5 million for vehicle and computer replacement, big chunk of that being a fire truck. Active transportation plan projects, park improvement projects as per the parks master plan, and ferry terminal projects upon assurance of return. So we've covered a lot of the costs. How do we fund it all? So we've talked about surplus, which we're all familiar with, having beaten it to death over the last little while. But the town is required to have an ongoing surplus from prior year's operations, which we do, and it's still over $2 million. But that does not mean we can't have a deficit in any given year. So, we will have a small one for 2024 as well, and it was anticipated. It'll be less than we budgeted for. We do have a long-standing policy that outlines the minimum balance that we should have for surplus, and as reported to council last month, we are below that, and we will be looking at adopting policies to get back above. We use a certain amount of surplus to balance the budget each year. It's 500,000 for this year, slightly more than last, plus the amount for dispatch. So by using surplus to balance the budget, we prevent overtaxing for current operations, because our normal expectation is that departments are given sufficient funds to carry out their mandate, but some savings will be realized throughout the year. And I say normal year because the last couple have not been normal because of the inflationary climate. So we have been relying heavily on surplus over the last few years to help us phase back to full taxation, and that has impacted our surplus levels. We will be looking at that in conjunction with next year's budget process. But as mentioned, we are planning to use 2 fairly healthy allocations over the next 2 years. Without surplus and safe restart funds, and with ongoing cost impacts, the remaining fallback is tax increases, unfortunately. The Safe Restart Grant was a large one-time allocation from the federal and provincial governments to assist with COVID-19 costs and recovery. It allowed the town to replenish our reserves that we used to balance the budget in 2020 after our tax cuts, and it allowed the town to carry the business tax reduction forward for multiple years. And it further allowed us to gradually transition back to closer to full revenues over the last few years. Our focus of the funds was to reduce the tax impacts for residents and businesses for the year since 2020. And we must now complete the transition to full tax funding because we have one less mitigation measure at our disposal. You're familiar with this table. It shows how we use the Safe Restart grants from inception up until the end of 2024. And at 2.758 million, that's a fairly healthy tax equivalent that ultimately has to be made up. Once all other funding sources are considered, the budget must be balanced through sufficient property tax funding. The tax increase is partially mitigated by new revenues through growth, and again, that's fairly modest this year. General changes in assessed value are factored out when we set our tax rates, which keeps our revenues predictable. And as we all know, different rates are paid by various classes of property, like residential and commercial. In 2022, Council approved a new policy to reduce the gap between residential and commercial tax rates, and approved a 10-year phase-in at that time for bringing them into closer alignment. 2025 would be year 3 of that transition. So in the past 2 years, the general tax increase has been slightly higher for residential than commercial as part of that plan to reduce the gap. 2025 is a bit of an anomaly, as there has been a natural gap reduction between classes due to changes in assessment. So residential assessment essentially stayed the same, went down a little bit, but commercial assessments went up. So that had the impact of naturally bringing that gap closer together. And information on that will be brought forward throughout the process, as Council will be asked to weigh in on the policy implications of that. I will provide more detailed information through a report, and we'll cover it in the next presentation as well. But we might be at a stage where our target was to hit a ratio of 2-to-1 between rates of residential to commercial. We might naturally be just under that now. The question is then, do we hit that 2 and keep it there, or do we let the natural assessment change do its thing? So our overall increase in property taxes required to balance the budget are just under $2 million. Last year it was about half of that. So the first $70,000 is covered from taxes from new construction, leaving just under 1.9 million as a general tax increase. And that's the amount that makes up the 12.85%. This table attempts to break down the tax impacts into categories we're familiar with. So we have changes to the core budget, nearly 700,000 in miscellaneous operational increases, 331 for police dispatch. The RCMP contract is a significant contribution. Reserve transfers, tax-funded capital, that debt servicing I mentioned, and the incremental items, supplemental, equate to 4.19% if approved. In terms of offsets, we've got an additional 186,500 in surplus funding that we've discussed, bringing the total impact to 12.85%. And just to provide context, each 1% increase in taxes only provides us with about 148,000 in revenue. And each 1% tax increase represents about $1.49 per month for the average residence. So how does that equate to the 12.85? You'll see here that a 12.85 property tax increase for the average home would lead to a $230 increase for the year, or $19 a month. There are some changes that I mentioned to water and sewer rates as well as garbage, and that will see the average household pay another $21 in the quarterly utility bill for those 3 services. Roughly the same increase for the average business. Now, a 5-year projection of what taxes are looking like in this financial plan. So in year 1, we're looking at a 12.85 going in, and year 2, it's down to under 7%. So you might recall that when we were standing here last year looking at this 5-year projection, we were projecting year 2 at 11.3%. You know, and normally year 2 tends to be overstated, but it wasn't last year, and I don't think it will be this year either. Whereas the last 3 years of the plan tend to be a little understated because, well, we're not going to build in anything that we don't know about. So we know some impacts that are going to hit us in 2026. One small one likely in 2027, but beyond that, we don't want to guess too much as we move forward. But you know, a large one-time bump makes a big difference moving forward. If we were to reduce the this year's impact to half, let's say, it just means that next year will be that much more significant, and each year subsequent to that as well. I do like to show how inflation and tax increases correlate, and this table shows over the last 5 years plus the current one, essentially since the pandemic, how CPI and the tax increases have related to each other. So over that 6-year period, CPI has increased by 20.7%, and the tax increase, if we end up at 12.85, would see a cumulative 6-year increase of 33%. Now, up until the end of 2024, those two numbers, i.e. CPI and tax increase, were almost identical. I think there was only a 5% difference. And now we're looking at about 13. And of course, we all know this is CPI, and that's not the inflation factor that is most relevant to town operations. Construction cost index is far more relevant, but CPI is the one that the media and a lot of other focus groups tend to focus on. More importantly, regardless of what index you look at, it's only a measure of the existing basket of goods, and it does not allow for the addition of new services. Almost there. So looking slightly ahead to the next budget meeting on the 18th, which is a Tuesday following the holiday Monday. The goal of that meeting will be to provide additional details on new or complex budget items through staff reports, to provide council with the first opportunity to ask questions, make recommendations, and add or remove items from the draft budget. Staff will ensure through the structure of the presentation that certain prompts will be provided where we focus on different areas of the budget and move on to each of the areas systematically. I think that tends to work best for us. And another goal of the second meeting is to provide taxpayers an opportunity to comment on what is or is not included in the draft budget. Although we hear from our taxpayers on an ongoing basis, this is a chance to see if we got it right, in their opinion. So at that meeting, the public will have an opportunity to comment at the beginning of the meeting. Staff will provide a brief summary presentation with some additional details that weren't provided tonight. We'll focus on the individual items that impact the tax increase, that being new capital projects that are tax funded, as well as supplemental requests. And the results of that meeting will be built into a second draft of the budget, and that's going to be considered on March 4th. So just a little shout out to all the services we provide and all the community organizations we fund in this slide. With that, I'd like to conclude by saying that staff are available to answer questions between now and the next meeting. And we'll be working on that detailed report as well as the next presentation between now and then. If there are any questions, Mr. Chair, on what's been presented, I'd be pleased to address.
Thank you, Mr. Hiswick, and certainly on behalf of committee, and I think the community, our appreciation for you taking us, back and through the process and clearly outlining, how it is we got to this starting position and next steps in the process to deliberate on the budget. So again, thank you to you and Ms. Chen for your work on preparing the budget for consideration. I'll ask you just to take the presentation down. You may have to pop it back up, but I just want to see Councillor Keith in the event she has a question, so that I can see her. But I would turn to colleagues now. Any questions with respect to the process for Mr. Hiswick, or anything maybe that wasn't clear to you as a part of the presentation that we would like to clarify at this point that will help you as you go through the budget binder in the weeks ahead? I'll yield and look to committee. Mayor McNeil-Smith.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. My question is pertains, or is best asked with the slide a few slides back. That is it says financial plan, and it's about 4 different colors, and it shows how the different impacts are. Yeah, that one. Thank you. So my sole question is with regards to the police dispatch. So in earlier slides, we saw that the police dispatch, if it comes to be, is recommended to be funded by surplus.
Yeah, sorry, your mic, Mr. Hiswick.
It's recommended to be funded by surplus. Go ahead.
I'll let you finish your question.
Yeah. So my question is that if police dispatch does not occur, looking at this slide, the property tax increase would be reduced. But the property tax rate should not be influenced if it's being funded by surplus.
This slide might be a little misleading. The top section shows all the cost elements, and the offsetting funding is down in the blue or mauve section, whatever your screen shows you. So increase in surplus funding of 186,500. That includes the 331,500 earmarked for police dispatch.
Okay.
They're just captured in 2 areas.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll ask my question in a slightly different way. If the police dispatch costs do not come into effect this year, will the property tax increase of 12.85 be lower?
No, it will not. We just will not be using the surplus allocation.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. So I do have a second question. What is currently the annual Canada Community Building Fund amount that we receive?
It should be 625,000 this year for the next couple of years, and then going up slightly beyond that.
I think, did it occur during the pandemic or for 1 year or 2 years where it was doubled and there was discussion, negotiations as to what the future would be?
I believe there were 2 instances of doubling up on the contributions, and I'm not aware of any pending plan to do any more of that.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Mayor McNeil-Smith. Looking to colleagues, Councillor Duncan.
Thank you. It's a small question. When you we're looking at the administrative changes, and there is kind of an allocation of staff towards more of the business licensing, because that's taking up a lot of time. Now, a few years ago, we removed business license fees, and we knew that that would cost some revenue, but we also thought that that would be more efficient in the long run, because we would be automating forms and potentially take some staff time out of it. Is that still true? And it would have been more work for the staff person if we'd been having those fees, or has this been something that we should re-examine for revenue in future budgets?
Thank you for the question, Councillor. That's a bit of a complicated one. There's definitely more staff time in the administration of business licensing. Some of that is due to a shortcoming in the software that we use that, for whatever reason, has a hard time accommodating a zero charge. So it requires a bit of a workaround, but that's not the main factor in allocating costs. It was just every year we look at where different staff, especially management, devote their time, and we allocate a little bit of we allocate a bit of their cost to that function in an attempt to provide the true cost of that function. So there's a little bit of trading back and forth each and every year. This time it was glaringly obvious that Mr. Newcomb and some of his staff were spending more and more time on the initial approvals, as well as the annual inspections that are sometimes required, and then the administrative burdens. And we may consider bringing back for reconsideration the free renewals at a future time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. Looking again to my colleagues at the table, Councillor Novak.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you so much for that presentation. Helps to clarify a lot of things. One thing that I'm always concerned about is surpluses, and I know we've had a lot of discussion about it. I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of surpluses, but I do have a question about the 5-year projection, and that is, does the 5-year projection include, when we're looking at in year 2, 3, 4, and 5, 6.8, 2.5, 2.45, and 1.43%, do those projections include an allocation for the replenishment of surplus funds that for which plan we are going to be looking in more detail in coming months?
Thank you, Councillor. No, that does not currently include any replenishment, because I committed to reporting back on that as part of next year's budget with a plan, so I don't want to presume how it's going to work. So this...
So I guess then we can assume, because we will have to replenish surplus according to a plan which is still to be determined, that those numbers are going to be definitely understated.
Years 3 to 5 are likely understated for that reason and other impacts that we're not yet aware of.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Novak. Again, looking to colleagues, I'll look online. Councillor Keith, seeing nothing from you. Thank you. It looks like that concludes questions at this point. Mr. Hissick, thank you very much. We'll look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks plus a day to continue on the process. And I would just note to members of council and the community, this is available for consideration, and staff, Mr. Hissick, available for answering questions in advance of that next meeting. And we certainly look forward to hearing from the community at that opportunity as well. That concludes items on our agenda for this evening, and so I'll look for motion to adjourn. Councillor Duck, seconded by Councillor Novak. All in favor? Thank you. Motion is carried. We are adjourned.